Take that jacket off before you step into my courtroom. The judge's voice cut across the packed room like a blade. Every head turned. Every eye landed on the woman standing in the aisle, scrubs stained with 12-hour-old blood, hair barely held together, a faded military jacket draped over her shoulders like she'd grabbed it running out the door. She didn't move. The bailiff stepped forward. The prosecutor smirked. And somewhere in the marble hallway outside, a 4-star Navy SEAL Admiral had just stopped walking, because stitched in black thread on the back of that jacket was a call sign he hadn't seen in 4 years, one that belonged to someone his team believed was dead. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories on this channel will wreck you in the best possible way. Hit the like button if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The shift had started at 6 the previous morning, and by the time it ended, Nora Voss had forgotten what her own voice sounded like outside of medical commands. 41 hours. That was the official count, though she'd stopped checking around hour 30 when the second ambulance bay opened up and they started triaging in the hallway. Callaway Medical Center in Port Hadley, Washington was not a large hospital, 212 beds, a trauma unit that had been renovated twice in the last decade and still smelled faintly of the old linoleum underneath the new flooring, and a nursing staff that ran lean because the budget always ran leaner. Nora knew the layout of that building the way she knew her own breathing, instinctively, without thought. Every turn and corridor mapped somewhere deeper than memory. She'd come to Callaway 3 years ago. Before that, there had been other places, other work, other versions of herself she didn't talk about in the break room, or at the nurse's station, or anywhere else people might ask follow-up questions. She had a 1-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from the hospital. She kept a go-bag by the door out of habit. She hadn't unpacked the bottom drawer of her dresser since moving in. The people she worked with knew she was good at her job. They knew she stayed late without being asked and came in on her days off when the unit was short. They knew she didn't talk much about herself, which, in a hospital full of people who talked constantly about themselves, made her either mysterious or boring, depending on who was doing the observing. Mostly they left her alone, and she was okay with that. She had learned in an earlier chapter of her life that being invisible was a skill. In combat, it kept you alive. In civilian medicine, it just kept things simpler. What they did not know, what nobody at Callaway Medical knew, was that Nora Voss had spent 4 years operating as a combat medic attached to a classified Navy Special Operations Unit designated Shadow Team, or that the callsign Shadow 7 had been assigned to her specifically during a mission cycle that ended with a casualty list no one was cleared to read, or that the burn scars that ran from her left wrist to her elbow, usually hidden under long sleeves, were not from a kitchen accident the way she'd mentioned once and never again. She didn't think about any of that while she was pulling on her jacket in the locker room at 11:22 in the morning. She was thinking about Marcus Delray. Marcus was 26 years old, former Army, 2 tours in places whose names still hadn't been declassified. He'd been working security at a waterfront bar called The Anchor, when 3 weeks earlier, a woman named Jessie Pruitt had been cornered in the parking lot behind the building by 2 men who worked for a local developer named Preston Volkov. Marcus had intervened. He disarmed one of the men and put the other on the ground using a joint lock that left the man with a fractured wrist and a bruised ego. The police report described what happened differently. According to the official version, Marcus had initiated an unprovoked assault on 2 men who had merely been arguing with a female acquaintance. The female acquaintance, Jessie Pruitt, had given a statement supporting Marcus, but her statement had been taken by an officer who worked part-time for a security company that Volkov owned, a detail that had not been disclosed when the report was filed. The 2 men Marcus disarmed had lawyers on retainer before the night was over. Marcus had a public defender he'd met twice. Nora had treated one of the alleged victims in Callaway's emergency department. His name was Derek Solis, and he'd come in holding his wrist and smelling like bourbon, and while she was splinting the fracture, she'd noticed something that made her stomach tighten. A folding knife clipped inside his jacket pocket, partially exposed. Not illegal. Not, by itself, incriminating. But the police report described the incident as a fistfight. No weapons mentioned. No search of either man's person documented. She had photographed the knife with her phone before she thought too hard about what she was doing. She had noted the make and model in her personal records, separate from his chart. She had flagged nothing officially, because the ER wasn't her jurisdiction, and she'd learned long ago that going through the wrong channels was sometimes worse than going through none at all. She'd done her own research instead. She'd found Marcus's name in the court docket, found his public defender's office number, called twice before anyone called back. She'd explained what she'd seen. She'd been asked if she was willing to testify. She had said yes without hesitating, which surprised her a little, because she had spent 3 years building a life specifically designed not to draw attention. The jacket was the last thing she grabbed because she was cold, and her locker was small, and it was sitting on top of everything else. It was old, soft from years of washing. The fabric faded to a gray-green that had once been a darker olive. She'd had it since before Port Hadley, before Callaway, before the version of herself that worked double shifts and kept her head down. The Naval Special Warfare patch on the chest had been removed, but on the back, in black embroidery that had survived everything, were the letters that had been stitched there during a deployment. Nobody talked about. Shadow. 7. She didn't look at the back when she put it on. She was pulling her keys out of her bag and trying to remember if she'd eaten anything since the granola bar at 3 a.m. The courthouse was 14 blocks from the hospital. She drove with the window cracked, the cold October air working better than the coffee she hadn't had time to finish. The Clallam County Courthouse was a 2-story building that had been built in the 70s and renovated in the 90s and not significantly updated since, and it smelled like wood polish and recycled air and the specific brand of institutional anxiety that Nora associated with places where important decisions got made by people who hadn't been asked to live with the consequences. She found the courtroom on the 2nd floor. Docket 44 CR, State versus Delray. She was 20 minutes early, and the hallway was already busy. The public defender, a young woman named Alicia Fong, who looked like she hadn't slept either, was standing outside the door reviewing notes on a legal pad. She looked up when Nora approached. "Ms. Voss, thank you for coming." A pause. "You look—" "I know," Nora said. "I came straight from the hospital." Fong glanced at the jacket but said nothing. "You're third on the witness list. Judge Caldwell runs a tight courtroom. Just answer what you're asked, don't volunteer, and if opposing counsel objects, stop talking and wait." Nora nodded. She had been debriefed in tighter rooms by people with a great deal more authority than a county judge. Inside the courtroom, she found a seat in the gallery 3rd row from the back. The space was filling. Not packed, but full enough that the low hum of pre-hearing conversation made the room feel smaller than it was. Marcus Delray was seated at the defense table, back straight, hands folded. He was broader than she'd imagined from the case file, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to hold very still in places where moving at the wrong moment could end you. He hadn't turned around, but she could see the tension in the line of his jaw. At the prosecution table, the assistant district attorney was a man named Jeffrey Strand, mid-40s, the kind of polish that came from a good tailor, and the belief that polish was a substitute for preparation. He was speaking quietly with a paralegal and didn't look at the gallery. The courtroom deputy called order and Judge Caldwell entered. He was older, mid-60s, with close-cropped white hair and the bearing of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in whatever room he occupied. He moved to the bench without looking at anyone specifically and settled into his chair with the comfortable authority of long habit. The hearing proceeded. Opening motions, a procedural argument about evidence handling that Nora didn't fully follow. Strand called his first witness, one of the officers who had written the initial report, a man named Briggs, who spoke with the flat confidence of someone who had testified many times and found it easy. Fong cross-examined him for 11 minutes and got, Nora thought, further than Strand had expected, because twice Briggs paused before answering in a way that wasn't quite natural. Then Fong called her first witness, a bartender from the Anchor who confirmed Jesse Pruitt had come in visibly frightened 30 minutes before the incident. Then Jessie Pruitt herself, who took the stand with shaking hands and told a story that bore no resemblance to the police report, her voice only steadying when she described Marcus putting himself between her and the man with the knife. Strand cross-examined her hard. He didn't raise his voice, which was somehow worse, just asked her the same questions different ways until the repetition started to sound like accusation. Nora watched Marcus's hands during that. They stayed folded on the table. Still. Fong stood. Your Honor, the defense calls Nora Voss. Nora moved from the gallery to the aisle. She was aware of what she looked like, the scrubs, the tired eyes, the jacket. She was past the point of self-consciousness about it, because self-consciousness was a luxury, and she didn't currently have the bandwidth. She was 3 steps into the aisle when Judge Caldwell's voice cut across the room. "Stop right there." She stopped. The judge's gaze was fixed on her with an expression she recognized. Not malice, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man assessing and finding insufficient. "Young lady," he said, "before you approach this bench, I will ask you to remove that jacket." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens in a place where the unexpected is supposed to be procedurally controlled. Nora looked at him steadily. "Excuse me? You are coming into my courtroom dressed like you've just come from—" He paused, letting the pause do the work. "Wherever you've come from. That jacket is inappropriate. Remove it before you come any further." Alicia Fong was on her feet. "Your Honor, my witness's attire. Counselor, I didn't address you." Nora had not moved. She was aware of everyone looking at her. The gallery, the bailiff, Marcus at the defense table who had finally turned around, his eyes finding hers with an expression she couldn't fully read. She was aware of Jeffrey Strand's small, satisfied stillness at the prosecution table. She was aware, more distantly, that she had not slept in over 40 hours, and that her left shoulder ached where it always ached in cold weather, and that the jacket she was being told to remove was the only warm layer she had. "Your Honor," she said, "I've come directly from a 41-hour shift at Callaway Medical Center. I'm here because I have relevant testimony in this case. The jacket, Caldwell said, is a distraction. You look unprepared, and frankly, you look like you don't belong here. Remove it or you will not testify." Nora said nothing for a moment. She had, in her other life, been told worse things. She had been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, qualified enough, present enough. She had been told those things by people in positions of considerable authority, and then she had gone ahead and done the thing they said she couldn't do because the work was the work, regardless of what anyone thought about her fitness for it. "No," she said. The word landed in the silence with surprising weight. Caldwell straightened. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no, Your Honor. I'm not removing the jacket." The intake of breath from the gallery was collective and almost soundless. Strand looked up from his notes. Fong had gone very still in the way attorneys go still when they're calculating whether intervention will help or hurt. Caldwell's expression shifted into something harder. "Bailiff." The bailiff, a heavy-set man near the door, moved forward. "Escort this witness to the hallway until she agrees to comply." Nora didn't back up. She stood exactly where she was and watched the bailiff approach, and her body did the quiet recalibration it always did when something physical was about to happen. Not aggression, just readiness, the settling of weight, and the sharpening of peripheral vision that had been trained into her through hundreds of hours of close-quarters work in environments where a moment's inattention was a medical emergency. The bailiff reached for her arm. "I wouldn't do that," said a voice from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. The man standing in the doorway was not in uniform, but he moved like a uniform. That particular economy of motion that came from decades of operating in environments where every step had consequence. He was broad-shouldered, late 50s, hair more silver than it had once been. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made clothing irrelevant. He was looking at Nora, not at the judge, not at the bailiff. At Nora, with an expression that mixed recognition with something she couldn't immediately categorize, something between relief and disbelief and a kind of controlled grief. The bailiff had stopped moving. Judge Caldwell found his voice. "Sir, this is an active proceeding. You will remove yourself." "In a moment," the man said. He was still looking at Nora. His voice was even, unhurried, with the texture of a man who is accustomed to being the calmest person in a crisis. "Nora Voss." She hadn't heard her full name said quite like that in 3 years. Like it meant something, like it had weight. "Do I know you?" she said, though she thought already that she might. You don't remember me. He moved a few steps down the aisle. Different context, different country. You'd been awake for about 30 hours when we met, and I had a sucking chest wound, which probably made both of us less memorable. A pause. I'm Rear Admiral Dean Hargrove. You kept 3 of my operators alive during the Kessler withdrawal. You were the last voice most of them heard before they were airlifted out. The room had gone the kind of quiet that had texture to it. Nora looked at him. The name was coming back to her through layers of classified memory. Not a name she'd known at the time, because that wasn't how those operations worked, everyone going by callsign and need to know. But the Kessler withdrawal, she remembered that. She remembered it the way you remember something that left marks. Shadow 7, Hargrove said quietly. Not asking, confirming. Behind Nora, she heard the shift of someone moving, and she turned slightly to see Marcus Delray at the defense table, watching with an expression that had shifted from tension to something more complicated. Alicia Fong had her pen flat against the legal pad and wasn't writing anything. Caldwell's voice, when it came, had lost some of its certainty. I don't know who you are, sir, but you are interrupting official court proceedings. Yes, I am. Hargrove's tone was not aggressive. It was simply accurate. I'm also interrupting an attempt to physically remove a decorated Navy combat medic from a court of law because of what she's wearing. So we can address both of those facts, or we can address one at a time. Whichever you prefer, Your Honor. The room went utterly still. Nora felt something happen in her chest that wasn't quite emotion, more like a pressure releasing that she hadn't consciously registered was there. She had spent 3 years in Port Hadley being no one in particular, and before that she had spent 4 years being the most critical person in a series of small catastrophic situations, and between those 2 versions of herself there was a gap she had mostly managed not to look at directly. Dean Hargrove had just looked at it on her behalf and said her name out loud in a room full of witnesses. The bailiff had completely stopped moving. He was looking at Caldwell, who was looking at Hargrove with the expression of a man who has made a decision he can feel starting to unravel. Your Honor, Alicia Fong said, and her voice had found steadiness from somewhere. The defense would request that our witness be permitted to take the stand. Caldwell did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from Hargrove to Nora and back. Strand at the prosecution table had gone very still, his earlier satisfaction replaced by something closer to calculation. Who are you to this witness? Caldwell finally addressed Hargrove directly. A man whose team came home, Hargrove said simply. The silence stretched another few seconds. Nora could hear her own pulse, slow and even, the way it went in situations that required everything she had. She was aware of how she looked, the scrubs, the jacket, the 41-hour shift written on her face. She was aware that half the room had been looking at those things and seeing nothing in particular, and that the other half was now looking at the same things and seeing something they hadn't seen before. She had not come here for recognition. She had come because Marcus Delray needed the truth told, and she was the person who could tell it. But recognition had apparently walked in through the back door anyway. Miss Voss, Judge Caldwell said, and the edge in his voice had changed into something more careful. You may approach. Nora walked forward. She did not remove the jacket. She took the witness stand, settled into the chair, adjusted the microphone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making do with available equipment, and looked out at the courtroom. Marcus was watching her from the defense table, and in his expression she read something she recognized from the faces of soldiers who had been told help was coming and had waited long enough to stop believing it. She looked at him steadily until she saw something change in his face. Alicia Fong stood and approached. Ms. Voss, please state your profession for the record. Trauma nurse, Nora said. Callaway Medical Center, Port Hadley. 8 years trauma experience, including 4 years field medicine in special operations environments. She heard the shift in the gallery behind her, the small intake, the recalibration. On the night of September 14th, Fong began, did you have occasion to treat a patient named Derek Solis in the Callaway Medical Emergency Department? Yes. And in the course of that treatment, did you observe anything that you believe is material to the events described in the police report? Nora looked at Jeffrey Strand. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who has just realized the terrain has changed
and is recalculating his route. Yes, she said. Several things. Fong nodded. Please describe what you observed. Nora had given hundreds of medical briefings. She had given them in field conditions with limited equipment and time pressure, to commanders who needed the clearest possible picture in the shortest possible window. She had learned that the facts, stated plainly and in sequence, carried more weight than any amount of interpretation. She began with the intake. The time Derek Solis arrived, his presentation, the fractured wrist, the alcohol level she'd documented, the specific pattern of injury that told a clear story about the mechanics of what had happened. She described the knife. She described photographing it. She described the absence of that detail in any official record. She watched Strand's face as she spoke, and she watched him make a decision about objecting and then decide against it because an objection would call more attention to exactly the things she was saying. Behind her, in the gallery, nobody moved. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she knew without being told that Dean Hargrove was still there, because men like Hargrove didn't leave before the situation was resolved. It wasn't in their nature. And she thought, briefly, about what it meant that he had walked through that door. She hadn't told anyone she had served. She hadn't told anyone because explaining what that service had actually consisted of would have required clearances she didn't carry anymore, and conversations she wasn't equipped to have over hospital break room coffee. She had put it away the way you put things away when the weight of them is too distributed across your entire self to isolate and remove. Not gone, just somewhere you don't look. And now it was in this courtroom, stitched on the back of a jacket she'd grabbed because she was cold. She was still talking, still laying out the evidence in sequence. The photographs, the timestamps, the medical record she had preserved. Fong was guiding her efficiently, asking the right questions in the right order. Marcus Del Rey's public defender was, Nora had understood from their 2 phone calls, considerably sharper than her appearance or her office's budget suggested. It was when she described the specific mechanical evidence, the fracture pattern on Solis's wrist consistent with disarmament rather than an offensive strike, the bruising distribution on his knuckles suggesting he'd been the one throwing punches, that she heard Strand finally push back his chair. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering medical interpretation beyond the scope of her expertise in this proceeding. Caldwell looked at Nora. I'm a trauma nurse with 8 years of emergency medicine experience, she said before anyone asked. I have assessed injury causation in emergency contexts thousands of times. I'm not offering a legal interpretation. I'm describing what the physical evidence says, which is what I was asked to do. Caldwell studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something working behind his eyes, some reassessment happening that he was trying to keep off his face. Objection overruled, he said. Continue. She continued. She was 12 minutes into her testimony when Strand asked to cross-examine, and Fong agreed, and Strand stood and approached the witness stand with the careful composure of a man who knows the terrain has shifted but hasn't yet admitted it to himself. Ms. Voss, he said, you work in an emergency room. Trauma unit, yes. Not a crime lab, not a police department. You don't have forensic training. I have medical training that includes assessment of injury causation, which is what I described. You observed a knife in a patient's pocket during a medical procedure. During a splinting procedure, yes. Did you report this knife to law enforcement? She held his gaze. I attempted to report it to the officer who was present for the intake. He told me it wasn't his concern. Strand paused. It was a short pause, but she caught it. Which officer? Caldwell said from the bench. Strand turned to look at the judge with an expression of slight surprise, as if judges weren't supposed to ask questions during cross-examination. Your Honor, which officer, Ms. Voss? Caldwell repeated. The intake officer's name was listed in the chart as Briggs, Nora said. Briggs. He was also your first witness this morning. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It had weight and direction to it. It moved across the room like weather. At the defense table, Marcus Del Rey had gone very still again, but differently still than before. Not the stillness of someone holding himself together under pressure. something more like the stillness of a man who has been in a hole for 3 weeks and has just heard the sound of a rope hitting the bottom. Strand was standing in front of the witness stand with a decision to make, and Nora watched him make it. He said, carefully, "Nothing further," and returned to his table. Fong stood, nothing further from the defense. Caldwell said, "The witness may step down." Nora stood from the chair. She adjusted her jacket, just a small pull at the collar, nothing deliberate, just the unconscious move of someone making sure a thing was in its place. She walked back down from the stand. She was almost to the aisle when Caldwell said her name. "Ms. Voss." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was working through several things simultaneously. A man intelligent enough to understand what was happening and honest enough to feel the discomfort of it. "Thank you for your testimony," he said, not perfunctory, something real in it. She nodded once and returned to her seat in the gallery. Hargrove was in the back row. She hadn't seen him come in. He had moved quietly, the way trained people did, and he was sitting with his hands loosely folded and his eyes on the front of the room, and when she slid into a seat 1 row ahead of him, he leaned forward slightly. "You cut your hair," he said, almost too quiet to hear. She didn't look back at him. 3 years ago." "I've been looking," he said. "We all have." She said nothing to that. There was a great deal she could have said, and she said none of it because the hearing was reconvening and Marcus Del Rey was at the defense table, and the rest of this story wasn't hers, it was his. But she was aware, for the first time in longer than she could honestly calculate, of being seen. Not as a nurse who'd stumbled into the wrong courtroom in the wrong clothes, as the specific person she had actually been, and still was, in the ways that things like that don't stop being true. Fong was calling her next witness. Strand was bent over his legal pad, writing something quickly. Caldwell had called a 10-minute recess, and the room was shifting and murmuring around her. And at the defense table, Marcus Del Rey turned in his chair to find her in the gallery. And when their eyes met, he pressed his lips together once. Not a smile, exactly. More like a man who has learned not to assume, but who can feel something starting to break open in his direction. She gave him a single nod. The recess was almost over. Strand passed Fong in the aisle, and she heard 3 words of what he said to her. The intake report. And she watched Fong's face do something she recognized. The face of someone who has just understood that the other side is trying to get ahead of a problem they already have. Outside in the corridor, through the door, she couldn't see but knew was there. Rear Admiral Dean Hargrove was making a phone call. She didn't know who he was calling. She didn't need to. She had told the truth. The truth was in the room now. And in her experience, the truth, once it was loose, did not stay manageable for the people who had tried to contain it. The bailiff called order. Judge Caldwell returned to the bench, and the recess was over. The 10-minute recess stretched to 14, and nobody commented on that because the kind of silence that had settled over courtroom 4B was the kind that made people reluctant to break it with something as small as a complaint about the clock. Nora sat in the gallery and did not look at Hargrove, who was 1 row behind her and to the left. She was aware of him the way she was aware of most things in a room, peripherally, constantly, without making it obvious. She had spent years in environments where the person you didn't track was the one who surprised you, and the habit hadn't softened just because the environment had. Around her, the gallery murmured. She caught fragments. The woman behind her saying something about the knife. A man near the aisle asking his companion who the guy in the back was. 2 older women near the front comparing notes in low voices about what exactly a shadow team was. Most of them didn't know. She was not going to explain it. The classified nature of that work hadn't changed just because Hargrove had said her call sign out loud in a public courtroom, and she filed that detail away as something she'd need to think about later, when there was time to think about anything except the immediate situation. Marcus Del Rey was conferring with Alicia Fong at the defense table. Fong was speaking quietly and quickly, her legal pad now covered in writing, her pen moving between words and crossed-out lines and small arrows indicating reorganization. Whatever Strand's comment in the aisle had signaled, Fong had clearly processed it and was restructuring something.
Marcus was listening with the fixed attention of a man who knows the person speaking is the only thing standing between him and a very bad outcome, and trusts them enough to let them work. Jeffrey Strand was at the prosecution table with his paralegal, and the conversation they were having had the texture of a disagreement. Controlled, quiet, but with the body language of two people who wanted to say things they couldn't say in public. The paralegal kept pulling documents from a manila folder, and Strand kept setting them aside in a way that suggested he didn't need what was in them, and the paralegal kept pulling them out again, which suggested she thought he did. Nora watched all of this without appearing to watch any of it. Then Caldwell returned. He moved to the bench with slightly less settled authority than he'd had before the recess. Not obviously. She doubted most people in the room noticed. But she had spent 4 years reading the body language of commanders under pressure, and she recognized the particular quality of a man who had used a short break not to rest, but to have a conversation he hadn't expected to need to have. His face was composed. His posture was composed. But something in the set of his shoulders was recalibrated. "We'll continue," he said. "Mr. Strand, you had indicated you wished to recall Officer Briggs." Strand stood. "Your Honor, after brief consultation, the prosecution will withdraw that request at this time." Fong looked up from her legal pad. Caldwell looked at Strand for a moment. "Very well. Ms. Fong, your next witness." Fong called Jessie Pruitt back to the stand for redirect, and Nora watched the young woman settle into the witness chair with marginally more steadiness than she'd had that morning. Jessie was mid-20s, small-framed, with the kind of face that looked younger than its age, and apparently made people think she wouldn't hold up under pressure. Strand had leaned on that during cross. The repetitive questioning, the slightly condescending patience, the implication that she was confused about what she'd seen. She wasn't confused. She'd been frightened, which was different, and Fong spent 12 careful minutes separating those two things out in front of the jury. During that time, Nora felt her phone vibrate in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out under the gallery railing. The angle blocked it from Caldwell's sightline, and looked at the screen. Unknown number, text message, 4 words, step outside after this. She looked at Hargrove's reflection in the window beside her, a faint smear of light and shape. He had his own phone in his hand. She put hers back in her pocket and watched the redirect examination. When Fong finished and Strand declined further cross, the judge called a lunch recess. 45 minutes. The gallery began its slow shuffle toward the exits, and Nora moved with it, not rushing, not lagging. Hargrove was beside her by the time she reached the corridor. He fell into step without making it look deliberate. The coordination of someone who spent years moving in proximity to others in tight spaces. "You texted me from an unknown number," she said. Force of habit. "Who did you call during the recess?" He didn't answer immediately. They moved through the corridor toward the stairwell, and he held the door for a woman with a large briefcase before he spoke. "The JAG office in Bremerton," he said, "and the regional NCIS liaison." Nora stopped at the top of the stairs. Around them, people flowed past and down. Why? Because the officer who responded to that incident, Briggs, is on record as a part-time contractor for a security firm that does work for Volkov Properties. He said it the way someone says something they've already confirmed. "That's not a coincidence I'm comfortable with." She looked at him. "How do you know about Volkov?" "I looked up the case." A pause. "After I saw your jacket." They went down the stairs. She processed that. Dean Hargrove had not been in the courthouse by accident. She'd understood that in the moment he walked in, but she hadn't yet worked out the full shape of it. He'd seen her name somewhere. The court docket was public record, the witness list was public record, and he'd come to the courthouse, and he'd been in the hallway at the right moment, or close enough to the right moment that the difference was irrelevant. "You were looking for me," she said. They were at the bottom of the stairs now, the lobby ahead, the cold light of October through the courthouse windows laying rectangles on the tile floor. "We've been looking for you for 4 years," he said. "After the Kessler withdrawal, the exfil was complicated. We assumed—" He stopped, started again. "The official report listed you as missing, not KIA, missing." She had known that. She had known it for most of 4 years and had made a decision about it that she revisited occasionally, late at night, and mostly arrived at the same place. I wasn't missing, she said. I came home and I stopped. I needed to stop. He didn't push on that. She noted it with the specific gratitude you felt for people who understood when not to push. They found a bench near the courthouse entrance. Around them, lawyers and clerks and witnesses and family members moved with the purposeful directionlessness of a lunch recess. Everyone going somewhere specific, nobody looking particularly settled about it. Nora sat with her hands in her jacket pockets and watched the door and thought about what Hargrove had just told her. NCISJAG. Two organizations that did not get involved in misdemeanor assault cases involving a former Army grunt and a real estate developer, not on the basis of a public defender's filing. They got involved when something larger came into frame. The Briggs connection, she said. That's not the only thing, is it? It wasn't a question, but he answered it like one. No, he said. Volkov Properties has 3 active contracts with Clallam County. 2 of them involve properties adjacent to the waterfront development zone. The Planning Commission approved both contracts in the past 18 months, and 2 of the 3 commissioners who voted yes have since received significant financial contributions from a nonprofit with ties to the Volkov Family Trust. He said this like a man reading from a document he'd memorized. That's a pattern that NCIS picked up in a different context 6 months ago. They've been building toward something larger. This case, he gestured vaguely in the direction of the courtroom upstairs. This case is one piece. Nora sat with that for a moment. Marcus Del Rey had not been unlucky. He had been specifically targeted because he had been in the wrong place at the right moment when the wrong people needed a different story to be true. Does his attorney know any of this? She asked. I sent Fong a message during the recess. She turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd sat down. He was watching the door with the same peripheral everything quality she used herself, cataloging each person who came through without appearing to. You moved fast, she said. I've had 4 years of practice doing things quickly when I get unexpected information, he said, and there was something in his tone, dry, quiet, that she recognized as the humor that people used when the thing they were describing was actually very heavy. She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but almost. The testimony I gave this morning, she said. The knife, the intake record. That's enough to raise reasonable doubt. Maybe enough for the case to be thrown. Probably. But it's not enough for what you're describing, the larger pattern. That's going to take more than a fractured wrist and a missing evidence item. Yes. So what do you need from me? Hargrove looked at her then, directly, and the expression on his face was the one she associated with people who have a request they've thought about carefully and are being honest about the cost. The ER intake record you kept, he said. The photographs. Chain of custody. I have them. NCIS will want those formally, with a statement. She had known this was coming from the moment she'd first photographed the knife. You didn't pull on a thread like that without understanding that the thread was attached to something larger, and that pulling it meant going further than you'd planned. She had understood it abstractly, the way you understood the probable consequences of a decision before you made it. Knowing it abstractly and sitting in a courthouse lobby, having someone make it concrete were different experiences. I'll give them the statement, she said. Hargrove nodded once. There's something else. She waited. The original evidence log from the night of the incident. The one that doesn't include the knife. He paused. Someone modified that log. Digital record shows a timestamp discrepancy between when the report was filed and when it was last edited. How do you know that? Because NCIS already pulled it this morning. She felt the shape of this settling into something clearer and more complicated than she'd expected when she'd pulled on her jacket 3 hours ago. She had come here to testify about a fractured wrist and a knife. She was now sitting in a federal adjacent situation involving evidence tampering, a compromised officer, a corrupt planning commission, and a real estate developer with what sounded like a very organized habit of making his problems go away. Marcus Del Rey had stopped an assault in a parking lot and ended up in the middle of all of that. The lunch recess had 22 minutes left. She and Hargrove went back upstairs. Fong was in the hallway outside the courtroom, alone, her legal pad held against her chest and her expression doing something complicated. She saw them coming and moved toward them, and when she reached them, she looked at Nora with the focused attention of someone who has just received information that changed the shape of the room she was standing in. Admiral Hargrove told me about the NCIS involvement, she said without preamble. I need to know how to use that. You probably can't use the NCIS investigation directly, Nora said. Not in today's hearing. It's not in evidence. But if it surfaces, if it becomes public, the timestamp discrepancy in the evidence log, Hargrove said, will surface. The NCIS liaison confirmed that if it's relevant to an ongoing proceeding, they can move to introduce it as corroborating documentation. Fong absorbed that. Timeline? Hours, not days. She pressed her lips together. We need to keep this hearing running as long as possible. Your closing witness, Nora said. The one you haven't called yet. Who is it? Fong hesitated for the first time. I was going to call a character witness for Marcus, his former unit commander. But that feels... She stopped. Given everything, that feels like the wrong move now. Why? Because character doesn't win this. Evidence wins this. She looked at Nora. Is there anything else you observed that you didn't testify to this morning? Anything that might... The admissions record, Nora said. Derek Solis was admitted as a walk-in. He claimed he came directly from the incident, but the triage time and his alcohol level are inconsistent with that. If he'd gone directly to the ER from the parking lot, the BAC would be higher. The metabolism timeline doesn't match. He went somewhere else first. Fong stared at her. You can testify to that? I can testify to the medical timeline. The math is straightforward. Why didn't you... You asked me to testify about what I observed during treatment. I testified about what I observed during treatment. You didn't ask me about the timeline. Fong closed her eyes for approximately 1 second, which was the condensed version of whatever she wanted to say. Then she opened them. Can I recall you to the stand this afternoon? That's why I'm here, Nora said. The recess ended with 5 minutes to spare, and they went back into the courtroom, and when Caldwell returned to the bench, he looked at both tables in a way that suggested he was aware that things had moved during the break, without being entirely sure how. Strand opened the afternoon session by calling a character witness of his own, a man named Richard Patton, who described himself as a community liaison for Volkov Properties, and spent 8 minutes painting Marcus Delray as an angry, unstable veteran who had been involved in 2 prior incidents at the Anchor. Fong cross-examined him for 4 minutes, and in the process established that both prior incidents had been logged by the same officer, Briggs, and that neither had resulted in formal charges or findings. Patton left the stand looking marginally less certain than he'd arrived. Then Fong recalled Nora. She went back to the stand without the specific weight of the morning's entrance, just the steady forward motion of someone finishing what she'd started. She settled into the chair and looked at Fong and gave the alcohol metabolism testimony cleanly and precisely, using exact figures, explaining the calculation without condescension, noting the discrepancy between Solis's claimed timeline and what his blood work indicated. Strand objected twice. Both objections were overruled. The second time, Caldwell's ruling came faster than the first. Something had shifted in how he was processing the testimony, and Nora was not entirely sure what it was, but the shift was visible. When she was done, Fong said, "Nothing further," and sat. Strand approached for cross-examination. He stood at the witness stand for a moment before he spoke. The pause of a man choosing a line of approach in territory he knows has been mined. "Miss Voss," he said, "you've testified extensively about medical observations, timelines, physical evidence. But you weren't in that parking lot on the night of September 14th. No," she said. "You didn't witness the incident. No. Everything you've described is interpretation. Everything I've described is medical evidence," she said. "The interpretation of physical injury and biological markers is the foundation of emergency medicine. It's not speculation. It's what trained clinicians do every day to determine what happened to a patient's body. But you can't tell us who started the fight. I can tell you what the injuries indicate about who was using defensive posture and who was using offensive posture. That's different from the legal question you're asking, and I haven't answered the legal question because it's not mine to answer. Strand was quiet for a moment. Then, you served in the military. The question landed in the room slightly sideways. Nora held his gaze. Yes. In what capacity? Combat medicine, special operations support. So you're trained to assess violence. I'm trained to assess injury, among other things. Does your military background, he said carefully, affect how you assess situations involving combat veterans? Do you feel a particular, he paused, affinity with Marcus Del Rey? The gallery stirred. It was a quiet stir, the shuffling of people who recognize when a question is designed to do something other than what it appears to be doing. Nora looked at him levelly. I treated Derek Solis, she said, not Marcus Del Rey. The physical evidence I'm testifying about comes from treating your witness, Mr. Strand. She watched him absorb that. Nothing further, he said, and sat. She stepped down from the stand and returned to the gallery, and as she passed the defense table, she did not look at Marcus, because looking at him would have been a choice, and she was not in the habit of making choices that were about her when someone else's outcome was what mattered. She found her seat. Hargrove was still in the back row. She could feel him there. Fong stood and addressed the bench. Your Honor, the defense has one final matter. We've received documentation this afternoon that we believe is material to the integrity of this proceeding. Strand was on his feet instantly. Objection. Any new evidence is not evidence, Fong said, in the traditional sense. It's documentation related to the chain of custody of evidence already entered into the record, specifically the original incident report submitted by Officer Briggs. She held up a single printed page. This is a digital audit log from the Clallam County Records Management System showing that the incident report was modified 14 hours after it was initially filed. The modification removed a notation about a secondary search of persons at the scene. The silence that followed was the densest one yet. At the prosecution table, Jeffrey Strand had gone very still. Not the calculating stillness from before. Something colder. Caldwell looked at the document Fong was holding. Where did you obtain this? It was provided to me by the regional NCIS liaison, Fong said, as part of an ongoing investigation into evidence handling in Clallam County. I received it during the lunch recess. Your Honor, Strand said, and his voice had lost its earlier precision. We need time to respond to... Mr. Strand. Caldwell's voice had changed. Something in it had hardened into a different shape than the authority he'd been wielding all morning. How much time do you need? The question hung in the air with its full implication attached, because the implication was time was no longer the thing that would help here. Strand said nothing for 4 full seconds. In a courtroom, 4 seconds of silence from an attorney is a long time. Your Honor, he said finally, the prosecution requests a brief recess to consult with our office. Caldwell looked at him, then at Fong. Then, briefly, so briefly that Nora almost missed it, at her. We'll recess until 9 tomorrow morning, he said. The gavel came down. The room exhaled. Nora sat without moving while people around her stood and gathered their things and began the low murmur of a crowd processing something it hadn't expected. She was looking at the defense table, where Marcus Del Rey had his head bowed over his folded hands. Not in distress, she thought, but in the posture of someone who has held himself together very tight for a very long time and is beginning, cautiously, to consider the possibility of relief. Fong put a hand on his shoulder briefly, said something close to his ear. Marcus nodded without lifting his head. Then his paralegal appeared from somewhere with a phone and leaned down to speak to Fong, and Nora watched Fong's face change. The hand came off Marcus's shoulder. Fong straightened. She looked at the phone screen and then she looked across the room and found Nora's eyes in the gallery. The expression on Fong's face was not good news. Nora was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. Hargrove was beside her in the aisle almost immediately. What happened? Fong was walking toward them fast, weaving through the gallery, and when she reached them, she held the phone so they could both see the screen. It was a news alert. Local station, Port Hadley Herald. The headline read, Callaway Medical Center, nurse under review for unauthorized patient photography. The story had gone live 11 minutes ago. Nora read it in 4 seconds. The substance was simple. An unnamed source within Callaway Medical had reported that a nurse had used a personal device to photograph a patient without consent during an emergency room procedure, violating patient privacy protocols. The nurse was described as currently involved in a court proceeding. The hospital was described as having launched an internal review. She stood in the aisle of courtroom 4B in the jacket they'd tried to make her take off, and read her own professional destruction being announced in a local news alert that had been timed to the minute of the court recess. And she felt something happen in the center of her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. Not fear, not rage. Something older and steadier than either. She had known, the moment she photographed that knife, that photographing it was not without consequence. She had done it anyway, and she was not, standing in this aisle, revising that decision. But knowing a consequence was possible and seeing it arrive in real time on a 5-inch phone screen were different. The gap between those two things was where the thing in her chest was living. Hargrove read it over her shoulder. He said nothing immediately, which was one of the things she had already noticed about him. He didn't fill silence with noise. Then he said quietly, "Volkov." "Yes," she said. Fong said, "This came from inside the hospital." "Or from someone with access to hospital HR systems," Hargrove said. Nora thought about Derek Solis's intake record, the photograph she'd taken, the fact that she'd used a personal device and not a hospital system, the fact that there was a difference between unauthorized and illegal, and that the distinction, while real and significant, would not stop Callaway from opening a review the moment someone with influence called the right administrator and said the right words. She thought about Preston Volkov, who had turned one parking lot assault into a criminal case against the man who'd stopped it, who had a county officer on contract, who had 2 members of a planning commission in his financial orbit, who had resources and habit and the specific kind of ruthlessness that came from a long track record of making problems disappear. She had become a problem. The courtroom was mostly empty now. Late afternoon light came through the high windows and lay across the gallery seats in long, pale strips. Caldwell was gone. Strand was gone. Marcus Delray had been walked out by Fong's paralegal, and the only people remaining were the 3 of them and a clerk gathering papers near the front. "What does the review mean for your job?" Fong asked her. Nora looked at the headline still visible on the phone screen. "It means I'll be placed on administrative leave while they investigate. Standard protocol." "How long?" "Depends on how hard someone is pushing from the outside." She paused. "Could be days, could be longer." "And your testimony? Does this—" "My testimony is already in the record," Nora said. "Whatever happens to my job doesn't change what I said on that stand." Fong nodded, but her expression was working through something more complicated than simple reassurance. A defense attorney thought about every angle, including the ones that hadn't appeared yet, and the angle Nora could see her working through was, if Volkov's people had moved this fast, this deliberately, what else were they moving on? Hargrove was already on his phone. She didn't ask him who he was calling this time. She looked at the windows, the light, the empty gallery seats. She thought about Marcus Delray going home tonight, not free, not yet, but with tomorrow morning as a possibility. She thought about 41 hours of work and a jacket she'd grabbed because she was cold. She thought about the 4 years she had spent being no one in particular in a town 11 minutes from the hospital, and the morning it had taken to stop being that. Hargrove lowered the phone. "NCIS is filing for access to the hospital's external communication logs," he said. "Any calls or emails to Callaway administration from outside numbers in the past 6 hours." "That won't stop the review," she said. "No, but it'll tell us who made the call." She looked at him. "And then?" "And then," he said, "we'll know the shape of what we're dealing with." Outside the courthouse, a car had pulled up to the curb that Nora didn't recognize. Dark, unmarked, idling with the particular patience of a vehicle that was waiting for someone specific. She noticed it through the window. Hargrove noticed it a second later because he was the kind of person who also noticed things through windows. "That's my ride," he said. "Where are you going?" He looked at her for a moment before he answered, and in that moment she had the specific feeling of being assessed not for what she could do, which she was accustomed to, but for something else. Something more like the look you gave a person when you were trying to figure out what they needed versus what they were willing to ask for.
I need you to come with me, he said.
She almost said no. She had an apartment 11 minutes from the hospital and a go-bag by the door, and every instinct in her body that had been built across 4 years of combat medicine and 3 years of careful invisibility was making the same calculation it always made about known quantities and unknown ones. But she was already on leave from a job that was being dismantled by a man who didn't know yet what he'd actually done by making her visible. She had already stopped being nobody this morning. "Give me a reason," she said. Hargrove said, "The NCIS team pulled Briggs's communications. He made 7 calls in the past week. 6 of them were to numbers we already know. The 7th was to the duty nurse supervisor at Callaway Medical." He paused. "The call was made 4 days before you were added to the witness list." The light through the windows was going amber with late afternoon. The clerk near the front of the courtroom had stopped gathering papers and was standing very still, though Nora didn't think that was about them. Someone had known she was going to testify before she'd agreed to testify. Someone had been watching her longer than today. She picked up her bag from the gallery seat and looked at the jacket she was still wearing, the faded olive fabric and the black stitching on the back that had started all of this, and she made the same decision she'd made this morning when she'd grabbed it off the top of the pile without looking. "All right," she said, and she followed him out. The car was a black Suburban with federal plates and the particular suspension of a vehicle that had been reinforced without being advertised as reinforced. Nora got in the back without asking about the driver, who was young, crew-cut, and gave no indication of having noticed her existence, which she recognized as a specific kind of professional courtesy. Hargrove got in beside her. The door closed. They pulled away from the courthouse curb into Port Hadley's late afternoon traffic. The waterfront commute crowd, the fishing industry workers heading home, the ordinary machinery of a small city doing its early evening thing, completely indifferent to the fact that the shape of something larger had just shifted inside courtroom 4B. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Field office? Bremerton's 40 minutes. NCIS has a satellite unit running out of the naval station." She looked out the window. The harbor was visible between buildings. Gray water, gray sky, the kind of October afternoon that committed fully to the idea of winter. "Tell me what you know about Volkov," she said. Hargrove had a tablet on his knee. He turned it so she could see. Preston Volkov, 61, born in Spokane. Commercial real estate, waterfront development, port logistics. Clean record officially. But NCIS has been tracking a pattern for 8 months. Bid irregularities on county contracts, payments to shell entities that connect back to a family trust in Delaware, the planning commission issue I mentioned. Small things, individually, the kind of things that are hard to prosecute in isolation. But they stack. They stack, and this... He tapped the court case file on the tablet. This was supposed to be simple. Marcus Delray gets convicted of assault. Volkov's people never get named. Jesse Pruitt stops talking. The waterfront development moves forward without the noise of an ongoing criminal case involving employees of a business on the property Volkov wants to acquire. Nora thought about that. The Anchor. The owner of the Anchor has refused 2 buyout offers in 18 months. If Marcus goes to prison, the optics of keeping the bar open become difficult. The owner has a daughter. The pressure becomes personal. She turned away from the window. He manufactured a conviction to intimidate a bar owner into selling. That's what it looks like. And now Marcus almost walks. Yes. She let the silence run for a moment. Outside, the water disappeared behind a row of commercial buildings. The nurse supervisor at Callaway, Briggs called her 4 days before I was on the witness list. We're looking at her communication history. She may not be a knowing participant. Briggs might have asked something that seemed routine, a reference check, an employment verification, something that let him flag your name and pass it to Volkov's people. But Volkov's people already had it by the time I agreed to testify. Yes. She thought about the 4 days between that call and her conversation with Fong's office. 4 days in which someone had known a combat medic attached to a classified Navy unit was about to walk into a case that was supposed to be simple. "Why didn't they move sooner?" she said. "If they knew my background, the smart play was to move before the testimony, not during." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "I think they didn't know about your background. They knew you were a nurse who'd treated Solis. The jacket changed things. When I walked into that courtroom," he paused, Volkov's people had someone in the gallery. She had not known that. She absorbed it. Someone identified you as Shadow 7, she said. Or someone identified me as the person reacting to Shadow 7 and ran the thread backward. The Suburban turned onto the highway heading south. The driver had not spoken. The GPS on the dashboard showed the route to the naval station in Bremerton, the progress line moving incrementally through the map. The patient photography complaint, she said. That's a tactical move. It doesn't stop my testimony because my testimony is already in. So what does it actually accomplish? Discrediting you for tomorrow, Hargrove said. If Fong tries to recall you for any additional testimony, Strand can use the HR complaint to question your professional ethics in front of the jury, introduces doubt about your judgment and your motives, which makes the medical evidence seem like it came from someone who already had a reason to manipulate it. Yes, it was a competent play, not elegant. It was the kind of move made by people who had resources and were using them reflexively, but competent. Volkov, or whoever he had tasked with this, had understood the problem within minutes of the recess and had moved against the most exposed part of the situation, which was her. She didn't feel personally targeted in the way most people would mean by that phrase. She felt tactically targeted, which was different, and her response to tactical targeting was the same it had always been. Assess the terrain, identify what she actually controlled, and work from there. What she controlled was the evidence she'd preserved, the photographs time-stamped, the medical record she'd notated at the time of treatment, with her own handwriting, before any of this was anything other than a clinical observation. The chain of custody she'd maintained by not sharing the photographs through any hospital system, which meant the accusation that she'd violated patient privacy through unauthorized photography, was technically accurate and practically meaningless in terms of what the photographs actually showed. What she did not control was the hospital. She didn't control whatever administrator Volkov's people had reached, or the speed of the HR process, or the question of whether she'd have a job to return to when this was over. She had known that when she photographed the knife. She had done it anyway, because Marcus Del Rey needed the truth told, and she was the person who could tell it. She was not sitting in the back of a federal vehicle doing 45 on the highway to Bremerton, revising that. They arrived at the naval station 43 minutes later. The NCIS satellite unit operated out of a building that looked deliberately unremarkable from the outside. The kind of institutional beige that existed in every military installation she'd ever been on, designed by the same philosophy that made everything blend into everything else. Inside it was different. 3 rooms, 8 people, more monitors than the size of the operation suggested, and the specific atmosphere of a team that had been working something for a long time and had just gotten a significant amount of new information in a short window. The lead agent was a woman named Carver. Late 30s, compact, with the focused efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped performing her competence for an audience. She stood when they came in and gave Nora the specific once-over of a federal investigator cataloging a new person in the room, then extended her hand. Nora Voss, Agent Dana Carver. Thanks for coming in. I didn't have competing plans, Nora said. The ghost of something crossed Carver's face. Not quite amusement. Recognition, maybe. We've pulled Briggs's communication records. We've pulled Volkov Properties' external correspondence logs, the ones available through public contract filings. And we've been in touch with the county records management system about the incident report modification. What did the modification remove? Carver led her to a monitor. On the screen was a document comparison. 2 versions of the same police report, the differences highlighted in yellow. The original contained a brief notation in the miscellaneous section. Secondary personnel search conducted at scene. No prohibited items found on Subject A. Subject B not searched due to departure before secondary team arrival. Subject B, Nora said. Derek Solis left before the secondary team arrived, which means he was never formally searched, which means the knife you photographed was never in the evidence chain because nobody ever looked for it. But the original report acknowledges he wasn't searched. Yes, and the modified version removes that acknowledgement entirely. So the official record shows a complete scene investigation with no notable findings, which is why the knife never came up. Nora looked at the 2 documents side by side. The modification was small. 2 sentences, removed from a section most people wouldn't read carefully. But the absence of those two sentences turned an incomplete investigation into a completed one, and a completed investigation that found nothing was a very different document from one that acknowledged a gap. "Briggs made the modification himself?" she asked. "The user ID on the edit belongs to his login credentials. Whether he did it voluntarily or under instruction, we don't yet know." "What does Briggs say?" Carver's expression shifted by a fraction. "Briggs hasn't been reachable since 3 this afternoon." Nora looked at her. "His car is in the lot at the police department. His phone goes to voicemail. He didn't show up to a 4 o'clock meeting with his lieutenant." "He ran," Nora said. "Or someone moved him," Hargrove said from behind her. The room absorbed that. The people at the monitors kept working, but the quality of the attention in the space changed slightly. A sharpening, the way a room of trained people responds when the stakes notation updates. "Which changes the calculus on tomorrow's hearing," Carver said. "How?" "If Briggs is a flight risk or a person at risk, NCIS can move to have the case transferred to federal jurisdiction. The evidence tampering alone gives us the hook. With the county contract corruption and the Volkov connection, we can argue this isn't a standalone assault case. It's part of a pattern of obstruction." "That helps, Marcus," Nora said. "Yes, but it also means tomorrow's hearing may not happen the way anyone planned it." She thought about Marcus Delray going home tonight to whatever apartment or borrowed room he was staying in, knowing that tomorrow at 9 in the morning something was supposed to happen that might end the 3 weeks of suspended uncertainty he'd been living inside. And now the thing that was supposed to happen was becoming something different, and he wouldn't know that until he showed up. "Does Fong know about Briggs?" she asked. "We're calling her now," Carver said. Nora turned away from the monitor and looked at the room. The agents, the screens, the particular organized intensity of people who had been working a careful, methodical case and were now dealing with the acceleration that happened when variables started moving faster than the timeline anticipated. She had been in rooms like this before, in different contexts, with different stakes. The feeling was recognizable. The difference between a situation that was controlled and one that was controlling you was often just the speed at which new information arrived relative to your ability to process it. When information arrived faster than processing, you were reactive. When you could stay one step ahead of it, you weren't. Right now, Volkov's people were one step ahead. Briggs disappearing was not an accident. It was either Volkov's team eliminating a liability or Briggs understanding that he was becoming one and removing himself. Either way, the person who could most directly connect Volkov to the evidence modification was gone, and gone people were less useful than present ones in federal proceedings. Carver's phone rang. She stepped away to take it. Hargrove came to stand beside Nora at the monitor. "The photographs you took," he said quietly. "NCIS will need them formally submitted tonight if they're going to move on jurisdiction tomorrow." "I know. That means giving them your phone." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You've been holding evidence on a personal device for 3 weeks." "Yes. That's not nothing, from a chain of custody standpoint. I've maintained a written log of the device's physical location and usage for the entire period. Dated entries. The photographs have original metadata intact." She paused. "I was a combat medic attached to a classified special operations unit for 4 years. I understood chain of custody before I understood how to start an IV." He was quiet for a moment. Then, almost to himself, "We should have found you sooner." "You found me when you needed to," she said. Across the room, Carver had finished her call and was moving back toward them with a specific quality to her stride. Not urgency exactly, but the compression of someone who has received information that requires immediate recalibration. "That was the lieutenant at Clallam County PD," she said. "Briggs came back." Nora waited. "He walked into the station 40 minutes ago. He's asking for immunity." The room shifted again. Hargrove's chin came up slightly. Nora kept her expression even. "He knows what he modified," Carver continued, "and he knows who told him to modify it. And apparently he's been holding that information as personal insurance for 6 weeks, since the morning after the incident report was filed." She paused. "He has documentation, emails. He printed them." "Printed them," Hargrove said. "Old school," Carver said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. Man was covering himself in analog. Nobody was going to find it in a search of his digital accounts. What does the documentation show? Nora asked. We don't know the full content yet. His attorney is present and they're negotiating terms. But the county lieutenant says the emails appear to show direct communication between Briggs and a man named Raymond Steck. Carver looked at both of them. Steck is Volkov's operations manager. He handles contractor logistics and… She stopped. He also handles security arrangements for Volkov properties. The chain was becoming visible. Not all of it, not yet, but enough that the shape was clear. Volkov needed the assault case to stick. He tasked Steck with making sure it stuck. Steck reached Briggs, who had means and access, and apparently enough of a conscience to keep records while following instructions. 6 weeks of sleeping on a stack of printed emails. That was either very smart or very frightened, or both. If Briggs's documentation holds, Nora said, what's the timeline? For charges? Days, not weeks. The modification is the clearest piece. That's a documented crime with a documented actor and a documented chain of instruction. The county corruption takes longer. The planning commission payments are in shell entities, and that unraveling takes time. But Marcus Delray's case, if Briggs testifies tomorrow to what he did and why, the prosecution's case collapses, Carver said. Strand will almost certainly withdraw charges rather than put his own witness on a stand where he'll admit to evidence tampering. Nora stood with that for a moment. 3 weeks Marcus had been living inside the waiting, and it was possible that tomorrow morning it could end, not with a verdict, but with a withdrawal, which was its own kind of vindication and its own kind of unsatisfying because the world would know he wasn't convicted but might never fully understand what had actually been done to him. That was a problem for later. Right now she needed to give Carver the phone. She pulled it from her pocket and held it out. Carver took it without ceremony, handed it to one of the agents, and said something about a forensic extraction protocol that Nora didn't need to follow because she trusted the technical people to do their jobs. That was the thing she had always understood about working in a unit. You had your specialty and you trusted the other people with theirs, and the thing you didn't do was try to control everything because you couldn't, and attempting to make you worse at the thing you were actually for. I need to make a call, she said. Carver gestured toward a quiet corner. She called Alicia Fong on her own number, from an agent's desk phone, because she no longer had her own device. Fong picked up on the second ring, and she sounded alert in the way people sounded when they had not yet been able to sit down. Fong. It's Nora Voss. I'm at the NCIS field office in Bremerton. Briggs came back. He's asking for immunity, and he has documentation connecting the evidence modification to Volkov's operations manager. A short silence. Then, tell me exactly what that means for tomorrow. She told her. All of it, as precisely as she knew it. Fong listened without interrupting, which was a quality Nora had come to appreciate in their limited interactions, the discipline of receiving information before responding to it. When she was done, Fong said, Marcus needs to know. Yes. I'm going to him now. A pause. Are you safe? The question surprised her slightly. She considered it honestly. I think so. I'm with NCIS. Volkov's people know you're the reason this unraveled. I know. That's not an abstract concern, Nora. She had thought about this in the car, in the way she thought about threat assessments, without catastrophizing, but without dismissing either. Volkov had moved against her professionally within hours of her testimony. Whether he would escalate beyond professional pressure depended on how much of a problem she had become relative to the resources he was willing to commit. With Briggs's documentation entering the picture, she had become a significantly larger problem. I'll stay at the field office tonight if Carver thinks that's appropriate, she said. Good. Fong paused again. For what it's worth. What you did today. Walking into that courtroom and not backing down. That was… She stopped. Started again. Marcus has been so careful not to get angry about this, not to show anyone how frightened he is. You gave him something to hold on to this afternoon. That's not nothing. Nora didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't hear it, but because she was trying to receive it without deflecting it. Tell him tomorrow is close, she said finally. I will. She hung up. The field office had settled into a working rhythm around her. Agents at screens, Carver on another call, Hargrove reviewing documents at a table near the door. The fluorescent light was flat and even and functional. The kind of light that didn't care what time it was, which was appropriate because the people in this room were not tracking time the way civilians did. She sat in a chair at an empty desk and let herself be still for a moment. She was tired. Not the acute tired of the end of a shift, the deep tired that lived in the muscle, in the connective tissue, the tired that had been accumulating since 05:30 the previous morning and hadn't been acknowledged because there hadn't been space to acknowledge it. The left shoulder was aching steadily now, a low, persistent signal she usually managed with positioning and heat that she couldn't currently access. She rotated it slowly and thought about what Fong had said, about Marcus being careful not to show anyone how frightened he was. She knew that particular careful. She had practiced it herself for 4 years in a different context. The deliberate management of what you allowed other people to see, not because you were trying to deceive them, but because the expression of fear or uncertainty in environments where others were depending on you had a real cost that you didn't want them to pay. You held it until you could hold it privately, which sometimes meant holding it longer than was good for you, and the accumulation of that holding was its own kind of injury. She was thinking about that when Carver crossed the room toward her with a look that Nora had learned in the past hour to read as meaning new information. Briggs's immunity negotiation is moving fast, Carver said. His attorney is good and the county lieutenant wants this resolved before morning, but… She stopped. But, Nora said. Steck, Volkov's operations manager. His phone went dark at 5:47 this afternoon. Dark as in off. Dark as in the number is no longer active. The device was either powered down or destroyed. After Briggs walked into the police station, Nora said, 40 minutes after. So someone in the station had told Steck that Briggs had returned with documentation, and Steck had killed his phone and was now presumably in motion. A man who knew he was about to be named in an immunity agreement had 2 available responses: lawyer, up and stay, or disappear. The phone going dark suggested he'd chosen the second, at least initially. He'll run, Hargrove said from the table. He'd been listening. If he runs, we lose the direct link to Volkov. Briggs connects to Steck. Steck connects to Volkov. If Steck is gone… Briggs's emails show Steck as the point of contact, Carver said. That's still documentary evidence. It's not as strong as having Steck available to flip, but it's not nothing. Where's Volkov? Nora asked. His residence is a waterfront property south of Port Hadley. We have an agent on the approach road. Nora stood. Her shoulder moved with the standing, the pain shifting location slightly. She thought about Steck in motion with a dead phone and Volkov sitting in a waterfront house doing his own calculation. And she thought about the shape of a situation where the critical variable, Steck as the connective tissue between a documented crime and the person who ordered it, was actively trying to remove himself from the equation. If Steck gets out of Clallam County before he's picked up, she said, how long does the case against Volkov survive? Carver's answer came after a pause that was honest rather than evasive. It gets harder. Not impossible, but harder. The emails established the link, but Steck's testimony would make it concrete. Nora looked at the room. 8 agents, 3 rooms, a situation that had been building for 8 months and had compressed into the past 12 hours with the speed that happened when multiple variables moved simultaneously. She thought about the sequence, the hearing, the jacket, Hargrove in the doorway, the news alert, the phone, this office, Briggs and his stack of printed emails, and now Steck moving in some direction they couldn't see. She had come to the courthouse today to testify about a fractured wrist. She was now in a federal satellite office with an operational clock running on a disappearing witness. Her phone was in evidence. Her job was under review. Her shoulder ached in the deep, specific way that winter always provoked. And the man in the waterfront house south of Port Hadley was making the same calculation she was, assessing the terrain, identifying what was still controllable, working from there. The difference was what they were trying to protect. Carver's radio crackled. An agent's voice, flat and efficient. Agent Carver, the approach road unit is reporting movement at the Volkov residence. Vehicle departing Southgate. Dark SUV, 2 occupants. Carver was already moving. That's Steck. He went to Volkov first. She reached the comms desk and picked up a radio. Get the county sheriff on the south approach. I need the vehicle stopped before the county line. The room shifted into a different mode, the compressed efficiency of people who had been waiting for the situation to break and were now moving with it. Hargrove was at Nora's elbow.
You should stay here, he said. I know, she said. She stayed. She stood at the monitors and watched a map update in real time. A blue marker on the South Highway, moving. Another marker coming from the county sheriff's substation, moving. The distance between them closing in the way distances closed on screens, in increments, with the impersonal patience of GPS data that didn't know what was at stake. An agent narrated quietly from the comms desk. Speed of the vehicle, road conditions, the sheriff's ETA. Nora watched the screen and thought about Marcus Del Rey, who didn't know any of this, who was somewhere in Port Hadley tonight with Fong's voice in his ear telling him tomorrow was close. She thought about the bar owner who had refused 2 buyout offers and didn't know that the refusals had set this entire machinery in motion. She thought about Jesse Pruitt on the witness stand with shaking hands. The blue marker on the South Highway slowed. The sheriff's marker closed the remaining distance. At 7:43 in the evening, an agent at the comms desk said, "Vehicle stopped. 2 occupants detained. Sheriff's office confirming IDs." Carver lowered the radio. The room breathed. Nora did not breathe quite, because breathing meant releasing something she wasn't ready to release, because this was one piece and there were other pieces, and the full shape of what happened next would take longer than tonight. Then the agent at comms said, "Confirming ID on passenger, Raymond Steck, and driver identified as Preston Volkov." Silence. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of something that has been moving finally, completely stopping. Carver turned and looked at Nora across the room. Nora held it for 1 second. Then her radio, the one Carver had given her when they arrived, crackled with a different voice. Not a field agent. Someone at the county level, the channel identification indicating Clallam County coordination. The voice said, "We have a report of an individual at Callaway Medical Center, asking for Nora Voss by name. Says it's urgent, identifying himself as..." Static. A pop. Then the voice came back. "Marcus Del Rey. He says the nurse supervisor at Callaway is gone. He says someone came to the hospital an hour ago and the supervisor left with them. He says..." Another pop, longer this time. When the voice came back, the words were clear, and the room that had just breathed went completely still again. "He says there's a woman being held. He says they have Jesse Pruitt." Carver was already at the comms desk before the static finished clearing. "Get me a location on Jesse Pruitt. Last known address, phone, emergency contacts. Now." She looked at the agent running county coordination. "Patch Marcus Del Rey through to this room directly." The agent worked fast. 30 seconds later, a voice came through the room speaker. Tense, compressed. The voice of a man who had spent the day in a courtroom trying to hold himself together and was now standing somewhere fluorescent and institutional, making a call he hadn't expected to need to make. "This is Marcus Del Rey. I'm at Callaway Medical. I need Nora Voss." Carver looked at Nora. Nora moved to the comms desk. "Marcus? It's me. Talk." A breath. Then, "Fong called me an hour ago, said to sit tight, so I sat tight. But Jesse called me first, before Fong. She said someone had been to her apartment. 2 men. Said they were from the county DA's office, but they had no ID and she didn't recognize either of them." A pause. "She was scared. She said she was going to go to the hospital because her sister works nights in the lab. I told her I'd meet her there." "When did she call you?" "Around 6. I got to Callaway at 6:20. Her sister's here. Jesse never showed up." The time was now 7:51. Jesse Pruitt had been in transit or in contact for roughly an hour and 40 minutes, and in that window she had either gone somewhere voluntarily or been directed somewhere by people who understood that the case had broken open and were managing what they could still manage. "Her phone?" Nora asked. "Goes to voicemail, has since 6:30. Carver was already coordinating on a separate line. Nora kept her voice even. "Where exactly are you in the hospital?" "Main lobby, by the front desk." "Stay there. Don't go outside. There will be agents with you and..." She looked at Carver. Carver held up 10 fingers. 10 minutes, Nora said. "Don't talk to anyone about this who isn't wearing a federal badge. Understand?" "Yeah." A pause. "Is she okay?"
Nora didn't have an answer that was both honest and useful, so she gave him the part that was actionable. "We're finding her. Stay put." She stepped back from the comms desk. Hargrove was already at her shoulder, because he had the particular spatial awareness of someone who anticipated movement and positioned accordingly. "Volkov and Steck are detained," he said quietly. "Which means if someone has Jesse, it's not Volkov's direct order. It's someone who anticipated the situation and moved independently." "Steck had people," Carver said from across the room. "We have 2 names from Briggs's documentation. Contractors. Former security. The kind that does the work that doesn't go in writing." She was reading from a screen. "One of them, man named Galt, is on record as a full-time employee of Volkov Properties. The other one we have less on." "Galt," Nora said. "Is he the one who was with Solis in the parking lot?" Carver looked up. "We don't have him placed at the scene officially. Briggs's original report lists 2 men with Solis. One was identified. One was listed as unidentified companion." She thought about the intake record. "Solis came in with a bruised knuckle pattern on his dominant hand, consistent with having thrown punches. The other man, if Galt was there, might have injuries we never saw because he never came in for treatment." "You think Galt was the second man Marcus disarmed?" "I think it's worth checking whether anyone matching his description was treated at an urgent care or walked into an ER between September 14th and September 16th with hand or arm injuries." Carver pointed at an agent without looking away from Nora. "Run it." The agent ran it. The room had the compressed energy of a situation where the variables were still moving, but the framework for managing them was holding. Nora had been in rooms with this energy before. Not often, but enough times to know what it required. You worked the information you had, and you didn't freeze on the information you didn't have yet, and you stayed useful to the people who needed you to be useful. Her shoulder ached. She did not mention it. 12 minutes after Marcus Del Rey's call, 2 NCIS agents confirmed arrival at Callaway Medical. 8 minutes after that, the agent running the urgent care search found a record. A walk-in visit on September 15th to a clinic in Sequim, 28 miles east of Port Hadley, for a patient who presented with a dislocated shoulder and a metacarpal fracture. The patient had given a name, an address, and an insurance card. All 3 turned out to be false. The description the clinic's intake form contained matched, approximately, the physical description in Briggs's report for the unidentified companion. Nobody said Galt's name out loud, but the shape of the room sharpened. "He was there," Hargrove said. "He was there," Carver confirmed. "And if Marcus dislocated his shoulder, then Galt has a personal stake in this case that isn't just professional," Nora said. "He's not just a contractor following Steck's instructions. He has his own reason to want Marcus convicted." The distinction mattered. Contractors following instructions became cooperative when the instructions stopped coming from a position of safety. Contractors with personal stakes were less predictable. "Phone records," Carver said. "If Galt has Jesse Pruitt, he used a phone to coordinate it." "Not his registered number," one of the agents said. "But if we pull cell tower data from the area around Jesse's apartment at 6 p.m., do it." The room worked. Nora stood at the edge of it and let the work happen around her, contributing where she had something to contribute and staying clear when she didn't. The next 20 minutes had the rhythm of a situation moving faster than anyone had originally planned for. Agents cross-referencing data, Carver coordinating with county sheriff and state patrol, Hargrove on a separate call with the JAG office, updating them on the scope expansion. At 8:19, the cell tower data returned a hit, a prepaid number that had pinged the tower nearest to Jesse Pruitt's apartment at 5:58 p.m., before her call to Marcus, and had moved south. The number had made 2 outgoing calls, one to a number that was currently disconnected, which was consistent with Steck's dead phone, one to a number that traced to a property management company in Sequim that turned out to share a registered agent with a subsidiary of Volkov Properties. The number was still active. Carver looked at it for 2 seconds. "Can we get a current location?" "Working it," the agent said. The location came back 3 minutes later. A commercial property in the waterfront industrial zone, South Port Hadley. A warehouse unit registered to a logistics company that was through 3 layers of corporate structure connected to Volkov's port operations. Nora looked at the map. The property was less than 4 miles from the courthouse where she'd testified that morning. How many agents do you have available for a site approach? She asked Carver. Here, tonight? 4. But State Patrol can put units at the perimeter inside 15 minutes. Is Jesse in danger? Hargrove asked. If Volkov and Steck are detained, Carver said slowly, Galt knows the situation is compromised. He picked up Jesse as leverage, or he picked her up to silence her. If it's leverage, she's an asset. He keeps her intact. If it's the other... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nora thought about Jesse Pruitt on the witness stand with shaking hands. The specific quality of her fear. Not performed, not exaggerated, just real. The kind you couldn't manufacture because it had settled into the body and lived there. She had come back to testify again after the lunch recess, even though nothing required her to. She had told the truth in a room full of people who could make her life difficult for telling it. We move, Nora said. Carver looked at her. You're not a field agent. No, she said, but I am a trauma medic with tactical experience. If Jessie needs medical support when you reach her, you want me there. Carver held that for a moment. Then she looked at Hargrove, because Hargrove was the senior military figure in the room, and there was a question in it. She's right, Hargrove said, and she's correct about the medical component. You don't know what state the witness is in. She stays back until the site is clear, Carver said. Agreed, Nora said, because that was a reasonable condition, and she wasn't in the business of creating operational problems for the people who were running the operation. They moved in 2 vehicles. State Patrol had units at the perimeter by the time they arrived. 3 cruisers staged a block out, lights off, waiting. The warehouse property was a low building set back from the water with corrugated metal walls and a gravel lot and 2 dock doors facing the access road. 1 light was on inside, visible through a gap in the roll-up door's weather seal. Carver ran the approach. She put agents at the secondary exit and at the dock access, and she coordinated the State Patrol to close the perimeter on her signal. She was methodical and quick and did not waste words. The quality of a person who had done this kind of thing enough times that the process was integrated rather than performed. Nora stayed at the vehicle with Hargrove. She had a field kit that Carver's team had produced from the back of the 2nd Suburban. Basic trauma supplies, the kind that reflected what the agents were prepared for, which was not nothing. She organized it while she waited, which was useful and also kept her hands occupied. You're calm, Hargrove said. I'm focused, she said. It's different. Is it? She thought about it honestly. Less than it used to be. He was quiet for a moment, then, after the Kessler withdrawal, when you came back and stopped, what were you trying to recover from specifically? It was not a question she had expected him to ask. Not here, not now. She looked at the warehouse, at the thin line of light under the door, and she answered because he had asked directly, and she was too tired for anything other than direct. Myself, she said. I was trying to figure out which version of myself was real, the one who did the work over there, or the one who could live in a place like Port Hadley and have a regular job and not have anyone in her building know that she can intubate a patient in the dark in a moving vehicle. She paused. I haven't finished figuring it out. You don't have to choose between them, he said. I know that now, she said. I didn't then. Carver's voice came through the radio. Moving. She watched the approach through the vehicle windshield, the 4 agents moving in the practiced way of people who had trained this kind of entry until it was muscle memory, not performance. State Patrol held the perimeter. The secondary exit team confirmed position. The primary team reached the access door, 30 seconds. The radio was quiet. Then Carver's voice, flat and clear. Site secure. We have the witness. She's conscious. Medical to the door. Nora was out of the vehicle before the transmission finished. She moved across the gravel in the dark with the kit over her shoulder and Hargrove behind her, and the agents at the door stepped aside as she came through. Inside, the warehouse was cold and smelled like machine oil and river damp. Boxes stacked along 2 walls. A folding chair in the center of the floor. Jessie Pruitt was in the chair. She had a zip tie on each wrist, looped through the chair back. Her face was intact, no visible bruising, but her breathing was fast and shallow, and she was shaking in the specific way that happened when adrenaline had been running high for an extended period, and the body was starting to metabolize it unevenly. There was a cut on her right forearm, not deep, from what looked like a metal edge somewhere in the space.
Nora crouched in front of her and did not touch her first. She made eye contact. Jesse, I'm Nora. I'm a nurse. The people with me are federal agents. You're safe. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere besides your arm? Jesse's eyes focused. Her breathing didn't slow immediately, but something in her face reorganized into the beginning of coherence. My wrists, the plastic, I'm cutting them now. She had trauma shears in the kit. The zip ties came off in 2 cuts, clean. Jessie brought her hands forward, and Nora looked at both wrists. Some abrasion from the restraints, nothing that indicated compromised circulation for the duration. Can you feel your fingers? Both hands? Yes. Good. Does your neck hurt? Your head? No, he grabbed my arm when he put me in the car. I don't think he meant to. She stopped. I don't know if he meant to or not. The cut on your forearm. How did that happen? I was trying to move the chair.
There was a metal bracket on the floor. Nora cleaned and covered the cut efficiently. Jessie's breathing was evening out as the immediate physical assessment grounded her. It was the response to being handled by someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't panicking, which communicated safety more effectively than words did. Where is he? Jessie asked. The man who brought me here. Being taken into custody, Carver said from behind Nora. Nora looked back. Carver had come in from the secondary entrance. Behind her, an agent was walking a heavy-set man with zip-cuffed wrists toward the dock door, mid-40s, moving with the stiffness of someone whose left shoulder was set slightly wrong, an old injury improperly healed. He was looking at the floor, not looking at Jessie, not looking at the agents. Galt had the face of a man who has run the calculation and knows the number. He passed through the dock door and was gone. Jessie watched him go with an expression that moved through several things in rapid succession. Fear, then anger, then something that was not quite relief because relief required a full resolution and the night was not yet fully resolved, but something in the direction of it. It's over? She asked. The immediate part is over, Nora said honestly, because Jessie deserved honesty and not the comfortable softening of it. There's still tomorrow. There's still the hearing, but the people who did this to you are being charged. That part is done. Jessie nodded. She was still shaking, fine tremors in her hands that would take a while to settle. Nora wrapped a thermal blanket from the kit around her shoulders and stayed crouching in front of her, not rushing her, not standing yet, giving her the physical communication that there was no urgency now that required her to move faster than she was ready to. Marcus? Jessie said. He called me. He's at Callaway Medical. He's fine. He knows you're safe. The tremors in her hands eased slightly. Something in her face went from tight to less tight, not all the way to calm, but noticeably in that direction. They transported Jessie to Callaway Medical for a full evaluation, not because Nora assessed her injuries as serious, but because protocol required it and because the hospital was the right environment for what came next, which was a victim advocate, a formal statement, and the beginning of the decompression process that would take a great deal longer than tonight. Marcus was in the lobby when they came in, and the expression on his face when he saw Jessie walking through the door under her own power was the kind of expression that happened below the level of conscious control. Relief so complete it briefly broke his composure, and he let it, for about 3 seconds, before he put it back together with the particular discipline of someone who had been keeping himself together for a very long time. He said, "Hey," and she said, "Hey." And then neither of them said anything for a moment, and that was fine. Nora stood back and let it be what it was. It was past 10 when she finally sat down. A staff room, 2 floors up from the emergency department, the familiar smell of hospital coffee and recycled air. Hargrove had gone with Carver to the NCIS office to manage the documentation of the evening's events, the detention of Volkov and Steck, the arrest of Galt, the formal intake of Briggs's immunity agreement. It was the kind of night that generated paperwork in direct proportion to its significance, and significant nights generated a great deal. She sat with a cup of coffee she wasn't tasting and let herself be tired for a minute. Her phone was still in evidence. She had borrowed one to call the hospital's after-hours HR line and leave a message about her administrative status, which was not a conversation she had been looking forward to, but which needed to happen. The person who answered had been perfunctory in the way of people handling things they hadn't been briefed on, and she'd left her name and a callback number and moved on. She was thinking about what Hargrove had said in the car, about not having to choose. She had spent 3 years not choosing, which was its own kind of choice. Callaway Medical was real. The work there was real. The patients were real. The department was real. But it had always felt like something she'd settled into rather than arrived at. And the difference between those two things was the kind of thing you could ignore for a long time and then suddenly couldn't. The staff room door opened. One of the night nurses, a woman named Petra, who had worked the department for 11 years and was not easily impressed by anything, looked at her from the doorway. "There's an attorney downstairs asking for you. Young woman. Says it's urgent." Nora stood. Alicia Fong was in the lobby, not the one where Marcus had been earlier, but the smaller one near the family consultation rooms. She had her legal pad and she was standing rather than sitting, which indicated she'd been moving for most of the past several hours, and sitting felt wrong. She looked at Nora, and something in her expression was working through two simultaneous things. "Strand called me at 9:15, she said. Nora waited. "He's withdrawing charges." Fong said it the way you said something that was true but cost something to say. Not in grief, but in the specific weight of a thing that should have been simpler. He's citing insufficient confidence in the evidentiary basis. He'll file in the morning before the 9 o'clock hearing. Marcus Delray would not be going back into that courtroom tomorrow to wait for a verdict. He was going to walk out of this situation without a conviction, without a verdict, just the clean cessation of a case that should never have been filed. "That's good," Nora said. "Yes." Fong paused. "The county DA is launching an internal review of how the case was filed and managed. That's going to take time, but it means someone is looking at how Strand handled this from the start." "Strand knew?" "That's the question the review is going to answer." Her voice was careful. "What I know is that the case against Marcus was built on a falsified report, and Strand chose to proceed with it, and whether he knew it was falsified or failed to ask the questions that would have revealed it, either way, that's a problem that doesn't go away." Nora thought about Jeffrey Strand in the courtroom, the polished composure, the careful cross-examination, the small pause when she mentioned the knife. Whether he had known or had chosen not to know was a distinction that mattered legally and didn't change much practically. "Where's Marcus?" she asked. "Upstairs with Jessie. She's being evaluated and he's waiting." Fong hesitated. "I told him about the withdrawal. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked if the people who did this were going to face charges." "Yes," Nora said. "That's what I told him." She paused. "He asked about you." "What did he ask?" "He asked if you were okay." Nora looked at the consultation room door. Behind it, a family she didn't know was probably having a conversation she couldn't hear about something that mattered enormously to them, the way things in hospitals always mattered enormously to the people they concerned. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. Fong nodded. Then she did something Nora hadn't expected. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs, just sat, like a person who has been moving for 10 hours and is acknowledging, finally, the fact of gravity. She looked at her legal pad for a moment, and then she put it face down on the seat beside her. "Can I ask you something personal?" Fong said. Nora sat in the chair across from her. "Go ahead." "When the judge told you to take the jacket off, in that moment, before anyone else said anything, what were you thinking?" She considered the question honestly. She had been asked versions of it before, the "what were you thinking" question, which was really the "how did you have the courage" question, which was really the "what made you different" question. People wanted a particular answer to it. They wanted something clean and formative, a lesson they could carry. The honest answer was less clean. "I was thinking about the chair," she said, "in front of me in the aisle. I was looking at it and calculating the distance to the witness stand and thinking about my shoulder and whether standing for a long cross-examination was going to be a problem." She paused. "And then he told me to take the jacket off, and I just didn't want to. Not for a profound reason. I was cold and I'd worn it for 20 years and I wasn't in the wrong." Fong looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, short and surprised and genuine. "That's it? That's it. Everything else happened because of that." Fong shook her head slowly. "Okay?" She looked at the ceiling. "Okay." They sat in the small lobby with its fluorescent light and its institutional quiet and the low background sound of a hospital doing what hospitals did at 10:30 at night, which was hold things together through the hours when the world had stopped watching. Nora was thinking about tomorrow. Not the 9 o'clock that wouldn't happen now, but the after of it. The question of her job, the question of what Hargrove had been describing in the car, the question of what version of herself she was building in the space that today had cleared. Her phone, borrowed, temporary, buzzed on the seat beside her. Unknown number. Text. She looked at it. This is Carver. 2 things. First, Galt gave up a name in processing. A third man at the scene on September 14th. Not Solis, not Galt. Someone who coordinated the approach. His name is Kenneth Rowe. He works for the county DA's office as an investigative liaison. She read it twice. Then the second message came. Second thing, Rowe has been processing county evidence logs as part of his position. We found 3 other cases in the past 2 years where incident reports were modified in a similar pattern. Different officers, different defendants, same signature in the edits. The lobby was quiet around her. Fong was still looking at the ceiling. Nora sat with the 2 texts and felt the shape of something much larger than Marcus Del Rey's case settling into visibility. Not one falsified report, not one compromised officer. A pattern, across 2 years, managed by someone inside the system with access to evidence logs and the cover of an official position, and Kenneth Rowe, who worked for the county DA, who had access to the same office that Jeffrey Strand worked out of every day. She put the phone down on the seat. Strand had not chosen not to ask the right questions. Strand had not simply failed to investigate adequately. If Rowe was the connective tissue between multiple falsified cases and the DA's office, then the question of what Jeffrey Strand had known and when he had known it had just become a very different question than the one anyone had been asking 12 hours ago. She looked at Fong. Fong had her eyes closed, head back against the wall, the legal pad still face down beside her. She looked like a woman who was allowing herself 60 seconds of something that wasn't quite sleep. Nora thought about waking her. She thought about the look on Marcus Del Rey's face when he saw Jesse walk through the door. She thought about 3 other cases, 3 other defendants, unknown, in the past 2 years. 3 other people who may have been sitting in a courtroom waiting for a truth that someone inside the system had already decided they weren't going to get. She picked the phone back up and typed, "I need a list of the 3 cases, names, status, tonight if you can." The response came back in 40 seconds, already pulling it. Nora set the phone face down on the seat. Across from her, Fong opened one eye. "You have that look," Fong said. "What look?" "The one you had on the witness stand when you realized Strand was going to object, and you were already 3 sentences ahead of the objection." She sat up. "What happened?" Nora looked at her. Alicia Fong, who had been awake for at least as long as Nora, who had built a defense case on a shoestring against a prosecutor with institutional advantage, who had reorganized her strategy 3 times in one day and had not once allowed the reorganization to become visible to the people depending on her, she deserved the honest answer. "We have a problem," Nora said, "and it's larger than we thought." Fong didn't say anything immediately. She picked up her legal pad from the seat beside her and held it without opening it, the way people held familiar objects when they needed something to do with their hands while their brain ran ahead of their mouth. "How large?" she said. 3 other cases, 2 years. Same modification pattern in the incident reports. Different officers, but the same signature in the edits. Which means someone with access to the county record system was coordinating across cases, not just acting in one. Rowe. That's what NCIS is working right now. Fong stood. The 60-second approximation of rest was finished. She was back in the mode Nora had come to recognize. The compressed, forward-moving attention of someone who processed information by moving through it physically. "If Rowe coordinated across multiple cases," she said slowly, "and Rowe works as an investigative liaison to the DA's office, then the question of what Strand knew becomes the question of what was possible to not know," Nora said, "which is a different question." Fong looked at the floor for a moment, not hesitating, processing. "The withdrawal of Marcus's charges is happening regardless. That's already in motion. But if there are 3 other defendants, We need names and case status tonight, Nora said. Carver's pulling the files. Fong was already dialing. Nora left her to it and went back upstairs. Not to the staff room, but to the third-floor family waiting area, which was empty at this hour except for a man asleep across 2 chairs near the window. She stood at the window and looked at the harbor. The water was black with orange reflections from the dock lights, and the fishing boats moored along the commercial pier were dark shapes against darker water, and the whole view had the specific quiet of a place that worked itself to exhaustion every day and then rested without apology. She thought about Kenneth Rowe, investigative liaison to the DA's office, not a prosecutor, not a sworn officer, the in-between role, the person who moved between law enforcement and legal proceedings, who had a foot in both spaces and therefore had access that was larger than either individually. The county record system required a logged-in user for every modification, but if Rowe had credentials and knew how to use them, he had the ability to reach into case files across multiple incidents without triggering the kind of flag that would surface in routine oversight. Briggs had modified the Delray report on instruction, but the instruction had come from Steck, who had presumably received it from someone who knew the system well enough to know it could be done. Rowe was the person who knew the system. Rowe was the person who had access. And Rowe had been present, according to Galt, at the original incident in September, the third man, the coordinator. He hadn't been there as a bystander. He'd been there to assess the situation and determine what the case management would need to look like afterward. Her borrowed phone buzzed. Carver. 3 cases. Here they are. She read the names. 2 men, 1 woman. 1 case still pending, a drug possession charge that Fong's office had no connection to. 1 case closed. Conviction 8 months ago. Defendant currently serving an 18-month sentence in a county facility. 1 case dismissed without prejudice 7 months ago. Defendant relocated out of state. The one serving time was named Devin Okafor, 23 years old. The charge had been assault causing bodily harm, arising from an incident outside a waterfront property that was, she noted without surprise, in the development zone that Volkov had been acquiring. She typed back, the Okafor conviction. Was the incident connected to a Volkov property dispute? She waited. Carver's response took 4 minutes, which meant she'd had to look it up rather than already knowing. The property adjacent to the incident site was acquired by a Volkov subsidiary 6 weeks after Okafor's conviction. The previous owner had been in a lease dispute with Okafor's family. They ran a marine supply business. Nora stood at the window with the phone in her hand and looked at the fishing boats in the harbor. Devin Okafor was 23 years old and had been in a county facility for 8 months for something that carried the same signature as what had been done to Marcus Del Rey, which meant he had not been unlucky. He had been specifically targeted, the same way Marcus had been specifically targeted, and the machinery that had targeted him had been running for at least 2 years, and nobody had noticed because each case looked individual. They looked individual because they were managed by someone who understood that patterns were only visible when you looked across cases, and the person coordinating the pattern was the same person who controlled access to the records that would have revealed it. She called Carver directly. Okafor, she said when Carver picked up. I'm already on it. Carver's voice had the tight focus of someone running 4 things simultaneously. His public defender has been notified. We're pulling the full case file tonight. If the modification pattern is there, and I think it's going to be there, we can file for an emergency review of his conviction. How long does that take? The filing is fast. The court response is less predictable. But with the broader pattern documented and a federal investigation attached to it, the pressure on the county court to move quickly is significant. He's been in there 8 months. I know. A pause that was not indifference but acknowledgement. We're moving as fast as the process allows. She understood that. She did not fully accept it, but she understood it, and the distinction between those 2 things was where most of the weight of institutional work lived, in the gap between how fast a situation demanded movement and how fast the systems that governed movement could actually go. What about Strand? She said. The DA's office has been notified about Rowe at the investigative level. Strand is... It's going to be a long night for him. Another pause. The question of what he knew versus what he should have known is one the state bar is going to spend a significant amount of time on. She thanked Carver and hung up. The family waiting room was still empty except for the sleeping man. She stood at the window a little longer and then she went back downstairs. Fong was off her call. She had 3 pages of notes on her legal pad now, written in the compressed shorthand of someone capturing information faster than full sentences allowed. She looked up when Nora came in. "I talked to Carver," Nora said. "You heard about Okafor?" "Yes." Fong's voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, more like the controlled acknowledgement of a wrong that was larger than the one she'd been fighting all day. "I'm going to file a motion for review first thing tomorrow, before the withdrawal hearing. If I can get them on the same docket. Can you do that?" "I'm going to find out." She looked at her notes. "The Okafor case was handled by a different public defender. I know her, she's good. I'm calling her at midnight if I have to." Nora sat back down. They worked for another hour in the small lobby, Fong on the phone and her legal pad, Nora moving between Carver's updates and the borrowed phone, and the particular kind of thinking that happened when you were tired enough that the noise in your head quieted, and what remained was just the shape of what needed doing. She got coffee at some point from a vending machine down the hall. It was bad coffee. She drank it. At midnight, Marcus Delray came downstairs. Jesse had been admitted for overnight observation. More precautionary than clinical, the attending had told Nora, but her blood pressure had been elevated and the stress response warranted monitoring. Marcus had stayed until she was settled, and then he'd come looking for them, and he found them in the consultation lobby, Fong still writing, Nora sitting with an empty coffee cup. He looked at them both for a moment. He looked the way people looked when they had been waiting for something for so long that its arrival felt disorienting rather than relieving. Not unhappy, but not quite finished processing. "The charges are being dropped," he said. Not a question. Fong had told him earlier, but he was saying it again in a different context, the way you said something again when you were checking whether it still held. "Yes," Fong said. "Strand is filing the withdrawal before 9. It's done." He nodded, sat down in the chair beside Nora's, not across from her, beside her, which was the choice of someone who had reached the end of a long thing and wanted proximity rather than conversation. After a moment, he said, 3 other people." "Yes," Nora said. "For how long?" 2 years that we can document. Possibly longer." He was quiet. His hands were folded between his knees, not the careful stillness from the courtroom, but just a person sitting, tired, trying to put something together. "If you hadn't come today," he said, "to the courthouse, with that jacket." She shook her head slightly. "Don't. I'm not." He stopped. "I just want to understand what the difference was between the day before yesterday and today. Nothing about my case changed until you walked into that room." She thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it about her, because the honest answer was both simpler and more uncomfortable than the version that cast her as the person who changed everything. "The truth was already there," she said. "It was in the evidence. It was in Jesse's testimony. It was in the record. The difference was that I had something that made them look at me instead of through me, and that changed whose testimony they were willing to actually hear." She paused. "That shouldn't have been the variable. But it was, and that's the part that should make everyone in that courtroom uncomfortable, including the judge." Marcus looked at her. He had the expression of someone hearing a thing said plainly that he'd been feeling for 3 weeks, but hadn't had words for. "He apologized," Marcus said. "Caldwell. Fong told me he called the public defender's office after the session. Said he wanted me to know—" He stopped again. "What?" "That he understood he'd let his first impression override his judgment, and that he was sorry." A beat. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," Nora said. He exhaled. "No, I guess not." They sat for a while. The hospital moved around them, the way hospitals moved at night. The specific rhythm of reduced staff and increased quiet, and the sense of time passing differently than it did in daylight. Fong made 2 more calls, short and operational, and wrote more notes, and eventually folded her legal pad and said she was going home for 4 hours and would be back before 8. Marcus didn't move to leave. He sat the way someone sat who didn't yet have a place to go that felt like somewhere to go. "You should sleep," Nora said eventually. "Probably." He didn't move. Then, "What happens to you now? Your job?" "It'll get sorted," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted. But the HR complaint was filed by a system that Volkov's people used to reach the hospital administration, and that system is now the subject of a federal investigation. The complaint doesn't disappear automatically, but its origin is going to be a factor in how the review proceeds. She paused. And Callaway has a trauma unit that's been short-staffed for 8 months. They're not going to be eager to fire their most experienced nurse over a complaint that originated from a criminal network. "Is that what you want? To go back there?" She looked at the window across the lobby. In the glass, she could see her own reflection faintly. The jacket, the scrubs underneath, the face that had been awake for going on 46 hours. She looked like someone who had been through something, which was accurate. "Yes," she said. "It's where my patients are." He nodded slowly, like that was an answer that made sense to him, which it probably did. He'd spent 2 years working security at a bar because the work was tangible and the people were real, and that mattered to him in a way that was not complicated. "Thank you," he said. Not performed, just the 2 words placed accurately. She received them the same way. "Go sleep, Marcus." He went. The lobby was empty again. She sat for another 20 minutes with nothing required of her for the first time since 5:30 the previous morning, and she let the tiredness move through her fully, the way you let a wave move through you when you stopped fighting it. Not surrender, just the recognition that resistance was no longer the correct response. Then she went home. Hargrove's driver took her. Hargrove himself was still at the NCIS office, which was going to be a long night for everyone there. And she sat in the back of the Suburban and watched Port Hadley pass outside the window. The harbor, the commercial blocks, the residential streets with their porch lights. The 11-minute drive. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Go bag by the door, bottom drawer still not fully unpacked. The ordinary mess of a life that didn't fully commit to permanence. She took the jacket off and hung it on the hook by the door, deliberately, not dropped, not folded over a chair. And she showered, and she slept. The withdrawal was filed at 8:47 the following morning. Fong called her at 9 with the confirmation, and the call was short because there wasn't much to say about it. The charges against Marcus Delray were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could not be refiled, meaning the case was closed in the completest legal sense available. The motion for review of Devin Okafor's conviction was filed simultaneously. The judge assigned to it was not Caldwell. The case had been shuffled to a different docket for obvious reasons. But the review was accepted within the hour, which Fong said later was faster than she'd expected, and which Nora thought was probably a reflection of how clearly the pattern had documented itself once NCIS started pulling threads. Okafor's conviction was formally vacated 11 days later. The 11 days were not quiet. The federal investigation into Volkov properties expanded to include the Planning Commission payments, the shell company structure, and the port logistics contracts that had been the financial foundation of the whole arrangement. Preston Volkov and Raymond Steck were charged with bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Steck, facing a longer sentence, began cooperating within 72 hours of his arrest, which Carver described to Nora in a brief text as expected and useful. Kenneth Rowe was charged with evidence tampering across 4 cases, obstruction, and abuse of a position of public trust. He did not cooperate. His attorney filed 3 motions in the first week, all of which were denied. Jeffrey Strand resigned from the county DA's office on the 4th day after the withdrawal, before the state bar could open a formal inquiry, though the inquiry opened anyway. The question of what he had known was being answered slowly, through documentation, in the way those answers always came, less like revelation and more like accumulation. The DA's office issued a public statement expressing full cooperation with the federal investigation and making no mention of Strand by name, which everyone understood as the institutional version of a door closing. Officer Briggs received a negotiated immunity agreement. His cooperation was described by Carver as thorough and his testimony as credible. He resigned from the police department the same day the agreement was finalized. Whether that felt like justice or like a bargain that ended better than it should have was a question Nora didn't spend time trying to resolve, because the alternative, Briggs with no agreement and less incentive to testify clearly, had been worse for everyone the pattern had damaged. Aaron Galt was charged with unlawful imprisonment, assault, and conspiracy. He did not receive a cooperation offer. He was held without bail pending trial, which the prosecutor's office described as appropriate given the circumstances. Nora learned most of this through Carver, through Hargrove, through the local news that she read on her phone during the 3 days of administrative leave that Callaway Medical had extended while the HR complaint was under review. The leave was uncomfortable in the particular way of enforced stillness. She was accustomed to the hospital as the structure around which the rest of her life organized itself, and without it, the days had a looseness that she didn't know what to do with. She unpacked the bottom drawer. It took an hour, which was longer than it should have taken for a drawer that contained mainly old photographs, a Navy service ribbon she hadn't looked at in years, a folded letter that she read twice and then put away, and a few items of clothing she'd been moving from apartment to apartment without wearing. She organized everything into keep and donate and one small pile of things she wasn't sure about, and she left the unsure pile on the dresser and came back to it later, which was not a resolution, but was at least an acknowledgement that it existed. On the fourth morning, Callaway's chief nursing officer called. Her name was Dr. Sandra Yee, and she had been running the hospital's nursing operations for 6 years with the organized directness of someone who valued clarity over comfort, and who had, in Nora's experience, always been fair. The HR review is closed, Yee said. The complaint has been formally withdrawn. In light of the investigation findings, the administration has determined that the original complaint was filed in bad faith and does not reflect on your professional conduct. Nora held the phone. Okay. I want you back on Monday. A pause. I also want to tell you, separately from the official part of this conversation, that what you did last week took a kind of courage that most people don't have. You knew what it was going to cost, and you did it anyway. Another pause. I don't say things like that casually. Nora was quiet for a moment. The drawer she'd unpacked was open across the room, its contents reorganized and visible. I'll be there Monday, she said. She was. The department was the same. Same layout, same fluorescent lights, same ambient noise of a trauma unit managing controlled urgency. A few of her colleagues asked what had happened in the tentative way of people who'd seen the news coverage and weren't sure how much to address. She gave short answers and got back to work, because the work was the thing that made the most sense in her body, and she had been away from it for 4 days, which was long enough. At noon on her first day back, Hargrove came into the department. He wasn't in uniform. He was in the civilian clothes she'd come to associate with him, the gray jacket, the air of someone moving quietly through a space that was not his native environment. He found her in the medication prep room and stood in the doorway until she looked up. You didn't have to come here, she said. I know. He came in. The formal commendation process takes time. The Navy's bureaucracy is, you know what it is. But I wanted you to know that it's been initiated. Your service record is being updated to reflect the full scope of what you did, including the Kessler withdrawal and the outcome. She looked at the medication she was drawing up. I didn't do it for the record. I know that too. He paused. There's something else I wanted to ask you, in person. She finished the preparation and set it down and looked at him. We're building a training curriculum for field medics attached to special operations units, the kind of cross-functional training that prepares people for the situations you handled, not just the medicine, but the integration, the judgment, the ability to function in institutional environments that are working against you. He paused. I'd like you to help develop it. Consultant basis, your schedule, no obligation to return to active duty. She thought about the staff room and the vending machine coffee and the third-floor window with the harbor view. She thought about Marcus Del Rey and Devin Okafor and 3 other people whose names she knew now, whose cases had moved through a system that should have caught what was done to them and hadn't until the right person happened to wear the right jacket on the right morning. She thought about the bottom drawer, open now instead of closed. When would it start? She said. Whenever you're ready. She picked up the medication she'd prepared. Through the prep room door, she could see the department, the movement, the purpose, the ordinary, extraordinary machinery of people working to keep other people alive. A paramedic was coming through the bay doors. A resident was reading an order. Petra, at the nurse's station, was doing 3 things simultaneously with the efficiency of someone who had been doing 3 things simultaneously for 11 years. "I'll think about it," she said. "Seriously." He nodded. "That's all I'm asking." He left the way he'd come, quietly, without ceremony. The way people moved when they understood that the space they were moving through belonged to someone else, and their presence was a visit, not a claim. She went back to work. The day moved the way days moved when the work was real, in problems and solutions, and the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly under pressure. She had a patient in Bay 3 with a pneumothorax who needed a chest tube placed with less cooperation than ideal, and she had an elderly woman in Bay 6 who had been waiting too long and needed an advocate. And she had a shift change to manage at 6 that involved 2 nurses who did not naturally communicate well and needed her to build a bridge between them, without making it look like that was what she was doing. She did all of it. At the end of her shift, she sat in the locker room for 5 minutes before she put her jacket on. Just sat, the way she'd sat in the consultation lobby the night of Jesse Pruitt's rescue, letting the tiredness be acknowledged rather than pushed past. The locker room had a mirror above the sink. She looked at herself in it, not searching for anything, just looking. The face that looked back was tired and real and recognizable. She had been awake for parts of the last 2 weeks that she probably would have rather slept through. She had walked into a courtroom in dirty clothes and said no to a judge and started something she hadn't fully anticipated the shape of, and the shape it had turned out to be was larger and more complicated and more consequential than a tired nurse in a faded jacket should have been able to produce. But that was the thing about truth, she thought. It didn't require you to be impressive. It required you to be present and willing and honest at the specific moment when presence and willingness and honesty were the things that mattered. She could have taken the jacket off. She could have stepped back, apologized, retreated to the hallway, and composed herself and come back in with the deference the judge expected. She would have still testified. She would have still given the medical evidence. And maybe, without Hargrove walking through that door, it would have been enough for Marcus. But maybe it wouldn't. And the maybe was not something she'd been willing to hand over to the judge's comfort. She wasn't built for deference to authority that hadn't earned it. She had tried to build that version of herself, and it had never quite fit, which was probably why she had spent 4 years working in environments where the authority structure was based on competence rather than position, and then 3 years in Port Hadley feeling like she was wearing the wrong size clothes every day without being able to name the fit problem. She put the jacket on. Outside the hospital, the October evening had turned cold, the kind of cold that meant November was no longer abstract. The parking lot lights were on and the harbor was dark beyond the buildings, and the first real wind of autumn was moving through the streets with the easy authority of something that didn't need anyone's permission. Her phone buzzed, a number she recognized now, Alicia Fong. She answered. "Okafor's out," Fong said. Her voice was the voice of someone who has just finished watching a long, difficult thing reach its correct conclusion. He walked this afternoon. His family was there. Nora stood in the parking lot and took that in. 23 years old, 8 months, a marine supply business that his family ran, adjacent to a property that a man in a waterfront house had decided he needed to own. He had not been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been in his own place, living his own life, and someone had decided that his life was smaller than their ambition. And for 8 months, that decision had been standing, and now it wasn't. "Thank you for calling," Nora said. "I thought you'd want to know." A pause. "He asked about you, by the way. When his attorney explained the chain of events, he asked who the nurse was." She didn't respond immediately. The wind moved through the parking lot and the October cold settled into her jacket, and she stood with the phone at her ear and thought about Devin Okafor meeting his family in the lobby of a county facility, the particular quality of that specific moment, the first breath of outside air after too long inside, the faces you'd been seeing only in visits now suddenly present in a different context, the world rearranging itself around you in real time. "Tell him I'm glad he's home," she said. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot a little longer. not because she needed to, but because the moment had the quality of something she wanted to be fully present for rather than rushing past. The harbor, the cold, the lights on the water. The building behind her with its 41 beds and its underpaid staff and its particular brand of daily heroism that never made the news because it was too ordinary and too constant to be called heroic, even when it was. There would be more work. The investigation would continue for months. Volkov's trial, Rose's trial, the systematic review of every case the modification pattern had touched, the slow institutional reckoning with how it had been possible for 2 years without anyone noticing. Fong would be in those proceedings as long as they ran. Carver's team would be documenting and testifying. The county court system would spend a long time looking at itself. She would give her consulting input to Hargrove's curriculum when the time came. She would go back into that department tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and she would do the work. And she would be Shadow 7 and Nora Voss simultaneously, without choosing between them, because they had never actually been two different people. They had been the same person, waiting in a bottom drawer for someone to have enough courage to come looking. She walked to her car. The jacket was warm. She had never taken it off. Some things you carry not because they're heavy, but because they're yours. And the weight, when it's truly yours, doesn't feel like weight at all. It feels like the only thing that fits. She drove home through a city that didn't know her name and had no idea what had moved through it in the past 11 days, and she thought about Marcus Delray and Devin Okafor and Jesse Pruitt and Alicia Fong and every person who had told the truth in a room where the truth was inconvenient, and she thought, that's how it works. Not in grand moments, not in speeches. In the specific, unglamorous, exhausting decision to keep saying the true thing in the room where it matters, even when, especially when, the room would prefer you didn't. Even when they tell you to take the jacket off. You don't.